Ibrahim Traoré in Moscow, Victory Day 2025, and the new global chessboard. The roar of jet engines cracked through the stillness of a cool Moscow spring morning like a gunshot in a cathedral. It wasn't just sound, it was vibration. A deep, rolling tremor that rattled window panes and stirred the flocks of pigeons off the rooftops. Over the misty skyline, a massive white silhouette emerged. An Ilyushin Il-96-300, the flagship of Russia's presidential fleet, banking low and slow toward Vnukovo International Airport. Its fuselage gleamed like polished bone in the pale light, its engines leaving faint ribbons of vapor in the cold air. This was no Aeroflot commercial, no delegation of businessmen or tourist charter. The Il-96-300 is the Kremlin's airborne throne room, an aircraft reserved for moments when the act of arrival itself is a message. It has carried Russian presidents, guarded ministers, and, on rare occasions, foreign leaders whose presence signals a tectonic shift in global alignments. Today was one of those occasions. The landing gear locked into place with a visible jolt. Wheels hit tarmac with a piercing screech, the noise slicing through the early morning hush. A brief pause, then the engines powered down to a low growl. Ground crews rolled forward. Cameras adjusted their lenses. Broadcasters leaned into their microphones. A door hissed open at the forward cabin, lowering a staircase like a drawbridge from a fortress. Viewers across the world were braced for the usual. A polished navy suit, a crisp white shirt, a bright tie, and the kind of diplomatic smile that looks the same whether you're shaking hands in Washington, Beijing, or Paris. But what stepped into view broke that expectation clean in two. Broad-shouldered, straight-backed, wearing an olive-green combat uniform adorned with insignia, a crimson beret tilted with precision, this was no civilian politician. This was a soldier. A sidearm rested visibly in a black holster at his hip, its polished metal catching the morning light. He descended with measured steps, neither rushed nor sluggish, eyes scanning the assembled crowd, posture betraying zero nervousness. This was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Transitional President of Burkina Faso. 36 years old, young by political standards. Younger still to be standing at the center of a geopolitical moment that would make headlines from Ouagadougou to Washington. And this visit to Moscow on Victory Day was unlike any diplomatic trip in recent memory. Why was a young African president flown on Russia's own presidential aircraft? Why armed in the heart of the Kremlin's capital? The answers would reach far beyond Moscow, deep into Africa's Sahel, and into the vaults of strategy rooms in Paris, Brussels, and Washington. Before the parade, the weight of Victory Day, May 8, 2025, Moscow was dressed for memory. Down Tverskaya Street, banners of the Russian tricolor rippled from lampposts. In shop windows, black and orange saint. George ribbons curled like medals. Elderly veterans in decorated greatcoats shuffled toward the metro, their chests heavy with the weight of campaign medals earned 3 generations ago. Victory Day, the anniversary of Nazi Germany's surrender in 1945, is no mere holiday here. It is the marrow of the Russian civic calendar. For decades, this day has blended solemn commemoration with orchestrated strength. Wreaths laid at the tomb of the unknown soldier, columns of tanks and missile launchers rolling across Red Square, the airspace above Moscow roaring with jet formations. For the Kremlin, it is not just memory, it is theater, diplomacy, and projection of power. It says, we have endured before. We can endure again. And this year, alongside the expected delegations from China, Central Asia, and a smattering of Middle Eastern allies, one name topped the day's intrigue: the President of Burkina Faso, dressed not for cocktails and speeches, but for the battlefield. Anchoring to history, the soldier leader image. For older American viewers tuning into the international feed, the image struck a familiar chord. Not with Moscow, not with Africa, but with their own history. June 1944, black and white photographs of General Dwight D. Eisenhower standing in a muddy English field, speaking with paratroopers of the 101st Airborne on the eve of D-Day. Eisenhower wore not the ceremonial garb of Washington politics, but a plain military jacket, the same mud-spattered boots as the men he commanded. The message was unmistakable. I am here with you in your fight. Traoré's arrival in Moscow echoed that image, except this time, the battlefield was not Normandy. It was the Sahel, a swath of Africa where insurgency, foreign military presence, and economic exploitation have collided for decades. Since taking power in a 2022 coup, Traoré has cultivated that image deliberately. No blue suits, no ornamental sashes. Only the uniform, the beret, and the ever-visible pistol, a walking declaration that his presidency is an extension of his command. His rhetoric matches the look. He speaks of sovereignty not as a policy preference, but as a survival necessity. He warns against neo-colonialism and puppet governments. His speeches carry the cadence of a man addressing soldiers in a staging area rather than legislators in a chamber. And in the eyes of his supporters, that's exactly what they want. A leader who stands in the dust and heat with them, not in air-conditioned offices signing away resources to foreign powers. In less than 3 years, Captain Ibrahim Traoré had rewritten the entire diplomatic playbook of Burkina Faso. 2023. French troops stationed in the country for decades under counter-terrorism agreements were told to pack up and leave. The final French convoy rolled out of Ouagadougou to muted applause from Paris and roaring cheers in the streets of Burkina Faso's capital. 2024. Burkina Faso joined the Alliance of Sahel States, a newly minted bloc with Mali and Niger. All three had recently experienced coups. All three had expelled French troops. And all three spoke with one voice against Western interference. 2025. Traoré made the boldest move yet, pulling Burkina Faso out of ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States. For decades, ECOWAS had been a cornerstone of West African political and economic integration. But to Traoré, it had become an extension of French and American influence. Each step was a political grenade lobbed into the carefully arranged architecture of Western Africa's post-colonial order. The Western response was predictable. Statements of deep concern from Washington, thinly veiled threats of sanctions from Brussels, and front-page editorials in Paris painting Traoré as a reckless populist steering his country toward isolation. But isolation never came. Instead, a different capital came knocking. Just as the United States had once rebuilt Western Europe with the Marshall Plan, the Kremlin saw an opening to reshape West Africa in its own image. In public, Russia's pitch to Africa was simple. We were never a colonial power here. We do not come to take, we come to trade. In private, the conversations were sharper, more transactional. We can train your officers, arm your army, and give you intelligence support without lectures on human rights. By late 2023, Russian military delegations were visiting Ouagadougou. Cargo planes touched down at night, their manifests unlisted in any public customs log. Burkina officers were spotted at Russian training grounds outside Moscow. The country's military academies began receiving young cadets from the Sahel. To Traoré, this was not charity, it was insurance. France's withdrawal had left gaping security holes in northern Burkina Faso, where jihadist groups roamed freely. Without a capable military partner, the country risked collapse. The Kremlin filled that void with methodical precision. Analysts in Paris and Washington warned that Burkina Faso was becoming a Russian client state. But in Ouagadougou's presidential palace, the calculation was different. Better to be a client of a distant partner than a dependent of a former colonial master with troops still on your soil. And so, when the Kremlin invited Traoré to Victory Day 2025, they sent not just a ticket, but their own presidential aircraft. The symbolism was unmistakable. Victory Day dawned crisp and clear. The sky was an impossible shade of blue, the kind you only see in May before Moscow's summer haze sets in. Red Square had been transformed overnight into a stage of steel and ceremony. The cobblestones gleamed from an early morning wash. Stands draped in red and gold awaited the elite. Along the Kremlin walls, colossal flags snapped in the wind. The air was thick with the mingled scents of gun oil and fresh flowers, rifles polished to mirror shine, wreaths prepared for the solemn march to the tomb of the unknown soldier. Crowds lined the barricades, 3 deep, waving flags, clutching smartphones. The voice of the parade announcer boomed over loudspeakers, rolling out the names of dignitaries as they took their places. And then, the rumble began. A formation of T-90 tanks clattered into view, their turrets swinging in perfect unison as if choreographed. Each movement was crisp, deliberate, designed to send a message not just to the crowd, but to every foreign military attaché watching the broadcast. Overhead, a flight of Sukhoi Su-57 fighter jets screamed past, trailing plumes of red, white, and blue smoke in tight formation. The roar reverberated through the square, drawing gasps from the audience. On the reviewing stand, Ibrahim Traoré stood in the front row shoulder to shoulder with some of the most powerful leaders on earth. Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Zimbabwe's Emerson Mnangagwa, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. His uniform was immaculate, his crimson beret perfectly set. The pistol on his hip caught the morning sun, a reminder, perhaps intentional, that while others stood as guests, he stood as a soldier. To the Kremlin's domestic audience, his presence was proof that Russia still had friends beyond its borders. To African viewers, it was proof that an African leader could stand on the world stage without bending the knee to Paris or Washington. And to Western diplomats watching from afar, it was a warning. The geopolitical chessboard had shifted again, and they hadn't even seen the last move. But the real significance of Traoré's trip wouldn't be seen on Red Square. It would unfold the next day, behind closed doors in a Kremlin meeting room. Conversations that could redraw not just maps, but alliances. The parade was still in full swing when Western media cut in with breaking coverage. CNN's Washington feed flashed a bold red chyron across the screen. Burkina Faso turns to Moscow. In the studio, the anchor's tone was grave. This is a clear rejection of France and the United States. We're witnessing a realignment in West Africa that could reshape the balance of power for decades. Across the Atlantic, French broadcasters broke into regular programming. On France 24, the headline blared, "Moscou séduit le Sahel." Moscow seduces the Sahel. The commentary was laced with unease. Former French diplomats accused Traoré of selling Burkina Faso's independence to the Kremlin, while others admitted privately that Paris had underestimated the depth of anti-French sentiment in its former colonies. In Brussels, the whispers were sharper. Could this be the first step toward a Russian-backed security alliance in West Africa? If Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger aligned militarily with Moscow, the European Union's southern flank, already strained by migration and terrorism threats, would face a new layer of complexity. For Western policymakers, the optics were bad enough. But the optics weren't the whole story. The real action happens in private, open-loop closure. The day after the parade, while Moscow's streets returned to their normal rhythm, a motorcade slipped quietly through the Kremlin gates. Inside one of those black ZIL limousines sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The meeting room was far from grand. The Kremlin reserves its most ornate halls for state dinners and photo ops. This space was functional, with polished wooden tables, muted green walls, and a single Russian flag behind the head chair. But its simplicity masked its importance. Vladimir Putin entered without ceremony, his expression unreadable. The two men shook hands, not the quick, perfunctory clasp of strangers, but the deliberate grip of leaders who understand they are negotiating something bigger than themselves. No press. No translators beyond the trusted few. The doors closed. Insiders later claimed the discussion ran nearly 3 hours. The agenda reportedly included joint military training, Russian advisors in Burkina Faso, and Burkinabe officers in Russian academies, arms deliveries, armored personnel carriers, small arms, possibly even light attack helicopters, Air Force cooperation, training, Burkinabe pilots on Russian aircraft platforms, intelligence sharing, particularly on jihadist networks operating across the Sahel. For Burkina Faso, this was an offer to fill every gap left by France's departure. For Russia, it was a chance to plant a long-term strategic foothold in West Africa, a region rich in gold, uranium, and critical transit routes. One aide reportedly remarked, "The Americans think of Africa in terms of aid. The French think of Africa in terms of control. The Russians think of Africa in terms of partnership, at least for now." When the doors finally opened, no joint statement was issued. No photos were released. It was as if the meeting hadn't happened at all. But for those who understood geopolitics, the silence spoke volumes. Thousands of miles away, in Washington's secure conference rooms, large digital maps of Africa were lighting up with new colors. In 2010, West Africa on those maps had been a solid block of French blue, a symbolic shorthand for France's deep influence over its former colonies. That blue was fading. By mid-2025, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, once reliable French partners, were now marked in deep red and black on classified U.S. intelligence visuals indicating their alignment with the Alliance of Sahel States and their overtures to Moscow. For military planners, this wasn't just about colors on a map. It was about flight paths for drones, naval port access in the Gulf of Guinea, overflight rights for military transport, and influence over key resource corridors. The Pentagon's Africa Command quietly updated its threat assessments. NATO analysts flagged the possibility of Russian military hardware appearing in West Africa within 18 months. And in Paris, the strategic shock was personal. Burkina Faso had been part of France-Afrique, the informal network of political, economic, and military ties binding France to its African partners since independence. To see it not just drift away but embrace Moscow felt like losing a chess piece France had assumed would always be on its side of the board. For ordinary citizens in Burkina Faso, though, the view was simpler. In Ouagadougou's markets, you could hear it in conversations over cups of strong tea. France had 50 years. What did we get? Now, we try with Russia. In the villages of the north, where insecurity had driven thousands from their homes, the calculation was even more direct. If the Russians help us fight the terrorists, then we welcome them. This wasn't abstract geopolitics. It was a bet on survival. Yet, as any student of history knows, survival bought with foreign arms often comes with a price tag hidden in the fine print. And that question, what will Russia eventually ask in return, was one that no one in Ouagadougou seemed eager to answer. Back in Ouagadougou, the capital's main boulevards were buzzing, not with parades but with phone screens replaying the same short clip. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, in his olive uniform and red beret, standing among the most powerful leaders on Earth in Red Square. Street vendors played it on small battery-powered TVs. Taxi drivers had it running on their dashboards. For many Burkinabe, the image was not about geopolitics, it was about dignity. For decades, their leaders had been photographed in Paris or Washington, often in the role of petitioner. Here was something different. Their president arriving on a Russian presidential jet, armed, confident, and treated as an equal. One shopkeeper summed it up. When they see him like this, they see us, standing tall. But symbolism can be dangerous if it blinds you to the stakes. Beneath the pride lay a complex reality. Burkina Faso was entering a new orbit, one that could bring military strength but also new dependencies. African history is full of moments when outside powers promised partnership and left behind only debt and division. Whether this was different remained to be seen. For American viewers, especially older veterans, Traoré's Moscow visit might stir a complicated mix of recognition and suspicion. Recognition, because the sight of a leader standing in military uniform side by side with his soldiers recalls moments in U.S. history when presidents and generals shared the risks of the front line. Eisenhower with the troops before D-Day, Truman visiting Korea. Even more recently, commanders in Afghanistan and Iraq, standing under a blazing sun with dust on their boots. Suspicion, because Americans also know the weight of foreign entanglements. They've seen alliances that began as mutual respect sour into resentment. They've seen the cost, in blood and treasure, of getting drawn into someone else's conflict. And yet, the core American belief still resonates. Freedom is never given. It's fought for. In this sense, Traoré's defiance of old colonial powers strikes a chord, even if his choice of partner raises eyebrows in Washington. It's the eternal story of the underdog refusing to bow. So where does this leave Burkina Faso? Is it blazing a path toward genuine African self-determination, breaking the chains of dependency that have bound the continent for generations? Or is it stepping into a new great power rivalry, where the colors on the flag may change, but the strings are still pulled from far away? That's the open question, echoing not only in African capitals, but in intelligence briefings and strategy meetings from Brussels to Beijing. History offers both hopeful and cautionary answers. The Marshall Plan lifted Europe from ruins, but the Cold War also turned nations into pawns on a global chessboard. The difference often lay not in the power offering support, but in the strength of the nation receiving it to set its own terms. Burkina Faso is testing that strength now. As the sun set over Red Square on May 9, 2025, the Russian tricolor rippled in the evening breeze, and the last of the military bands packed away their instruments. Somewhere inside the Kremlin, the agreements discussed between Putin and Traoré waited to be translated into action. In Ouagadougou, the same night, families gathered around radios and TV sets, listening to news anchors speak of a new chapter in the nation's history. Children went to bed dreaming of a future where Burkina Faso could stand on its own. But history is not made in dreams. It's forged in choices, and in the costs those choices demand. Will the Russian partnership deliver the security and independence Traoré promises? Or will it be remembered decades from now as the moment Burkina Faso traded one shadow for another? The world is watching. Moscow is patient. And the Sahel is a place where patience can be rewarded or betrayed. If you believe history should not be written only by the strongest, but also by those who dare to rise, then share this story. Because from the deserts of West Africa to the cobblestones of Red Square, from the roar of jet engines over Moscow to the whispers in Washington's war rooms, the game has only just begun.